Hello, and welcome to another episode of Keep It Fictional. I am joined by my book friends, Sadie, Allison, Virginia, and Corrine, and I am Fiona. I will be your host today. And today's episode theme is a little bit of a comedy of errors. Because we are going to be reading books by famous people. Not famous authors, but famous people, celebrities from other areas. But not just books, but novels. So when I chose this topic, I interpreted it as books, meaning you could do an autobiography or a memoir. I later realized that we had specifically said novels, and I had to rethink things, which led me to think, should famous people who are not authors really write books? So that's the question of the episode today. We are going to see what everyone has read and whether it's really fair to be a multi-talented person, or whether we think these people should maybe stay in their own lane. So we are going to move over to Allison with our first book today.
All right. So today I come to you with a book by an actor known best for his role in The X-Files as Fox Mulder, but he is also a singer-songwriter and an author of multiple novels. That's right. Today we are talking about The Reservoir by David Duchovny. So this was an interesting book. Um, It's definitely not my usual genre. It is more literary fiction than it is genre fiction. But this book follows Ridley, a retired financier from Wall Street who is living alone and feeling very isolated because not only is he divorced and somewhat distanced from his daughter, but also it is New York City during the height of the coronavirus pandemic. So our narrator, our main character, is living by himself, has barely left his apartment in months, and is busying himself by taking uh, time-lapse photography of the reservoir that he can see from his apartment window. But one day, when he is going over his reservoir photos, he realizes that there is someone across the park turning the lights of their apartment on and off in the middle of the night. And he becomes obsessed with figuring out who this is, what they are signaling, and whether or not they're signaling to him. So Ridley goes on a quest to figure out exactly what's going on with this light flickering person across Central Park, and along the way has a lot of philosophical thoughts. So, like I said before, this is not my usual genre. I think that David Duchovny is surprisingly a pretty decent author. Surprisingly, because I personally went in with fairly low expectations for this book. Um, I did enjoy parts of it. I found the writing was occasionally a little florid for my taste, but overall, I think it was an interesting read. And if you are interested in literary fiction, if you are interested in if you like the X-Files and you want to see what David Duchovny has been doing, um, definitely take a look at this book. It was really interesting, and while it was not my genre, I definitely had a blast reading it.
Thanks so much, Allison. Stay tuned for possible more David Duchovny. Okay, we are going to move on to Sadie now. Um, can't wait to hear about this one.
Okay. So finding this book, I to be honest with you, I don't exactly know what led me to this book. I was not a huge fan of this person when they were kind of in full fame. But I appreciate what they do now. This person was a child star and since then has actually gotten very, very involved in the parenting world, and has been a very strong advocate for certain types of parenting. And yes, I know, some strange looks. But if you are familiar kind of with parenting blogs and parenting Instagram accounts and things like that, she is very active in this world. Her sister is also on the Food Network, which I love the Food Network. So anyways, as I'm sure you can tell from my very vague description, I am of course talking about Hilary Duff, Lizzie McGuire, our child star, who had her own TV show and had a short music career, I think. I don't know if she's still making music. She might be. And anyways, her sister Haley is on the Food Network. And now she has written a trilogy, not just one novel. She has written a trilogy. So I picked the first book of her trilogy, and this book is called Elixir. That's probably very difficult to see. It's called Elixir, and it is a YA paranormal romance. Would kind of seem right up my alley. And our story revolves around either Clea or Clea. This is one time where I really wish I had the audiobook while I was reading this because I have no idea how to pronounce this name. Clea. I'm going to say Clea. So Clea is the daughter of a senator, and she kind of has a lot of advantages in her life. She gets to travel all over the world, even though she has to kind of watch where she's going and make sure there's security around. She does get to travel wherever she wants to. She has an alter ego where she has quite a successful photojournalism career. She has her best friend, Raina, who she's literally known since the day that she was born, and they're super, super close. She has her other best friend, Ben, who was hired to be sort of her cultural advisor on her travels, who she's really close with him as well. And she kind of has it all going for her, except that her dad died. And Clea was very, very close with her dad. And no one really knows what happened to him. He was a doctor and he was on a visit to South America and disappeared. Nobody knows where he went. Nobody knows kind of what happened leading up to his disappearance. All that they found out was just that he went off to talk to one of the local patients, which he used to do all the time, and he never came back. Months later, they declare him dead. They have a funeral, and Clea and her mom are able to start moving on and start grieving. But Clea was never really able to do that. One thing that he inspired in her was her love of photography and her photojournalism career. So she holds on to that as a connection to her dad. So on one trip, she's in Paris with Raina, and they're at a club, and Raina meets someone that she decides that she's going to go home with. Clea is exhausted and just wants to go back to the room, so she does that and spends her whole night taking photos, which she always does, and finally goes to sleep and wakes up to a horrible, horrible dream about her father being killed in a burning building. She doesn't know if this is what happened, but this is what her dreams are telling her. She also wakes up to find that Raina was also in a burning building that very night. The person that she went home with, his apartment caught on fire and the whole apartment burned down. Raina is okay. They went out to get food in a very believable twist. They went out to get food and Raina is fine. So once Clea learns that, she decides, hey, let's take some more pictures. So she starts photographing this burning building as it is crumbling down to the ground. Anyways, their trip is over. They go back to Connecticut where they live, and Clea is looking through all of the photos from her trip. And it's the one of the burning building that she first spots the image of a man. She's never seen him before. He looks very, very casual. He's not a firefighter. He doesn't look like he's been kind of torn out of his house in the middle of the night to race down to the street because of a fire. He just looks very casual, and he's just standing there staring. But he's not staring at the building. He's staring at the camera. He's staring at Clea. She's a little bit unnerved, but just kind of brushes it off as a bystander who maybe noticed her taking photos. But then she starts looking through more of her pictures from their trip around Europe. And she starts noticing this person in all of them. Sometimes she notices him standing in the middle of the sky, not on anything. He's just there. Yeah. So anyways, she is a little freaked out and decides to test a theory that she has. So she starts taking pictures in her room. She spins around, she takes all these pictures, and she looks at them. And there he is, standing in her closet. She is terrified, but she looks in her closet. He's not there. So she has no idea what is going on, but she is prepared to push it aside for now. She puts on the Food Network to try and get some sleep, turns up all of the lights, and sees if maybe she can get some sleep. So while she's asleep, finally she goes to sleep, and she starts to have a dream. And in this dream, she is a jazz singer from the 1920s, and she is working at a club where she's controlled by the club owner. She doesn't know what she's going to do. She doesn't know how to get out. But then there's the piano player. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, the piano player in her dream is this man that she sees in her photos. So over the next few nights, Clea starts to have more of these dreams. And in each dream, she is someone different. Once she is a young woman from the 1600s. Another time she is an actress from the 1800s. And then she is also this jazz singer from the 1920s. And in every single one of her dreams, this man is there. And this man is her love. He is the love of her life. And she starts to become obsessed with this man. She starts to want to have these dreams. She starts to want to go to sleep so that she can have these dreams and see this man. Okay, now, I know, yeah, there's more. So she finally decides to tell Ben about these images in her camera that she is having. He doesn't exactly respond. Now, Ben is one of her best friends. He doesn't respond in the way that she thinks he does. He gets really freaked out. He tells her she has to show him the pictures. And once she does, he takes her downstairs to her father's study, which has been left exactly as it was when he disappeared. And he shows her images of this man from pictures that her father had taken of Clea when she was a baby, of Clea when she was a young girl, of Clea through her whole life. Now, what we might not know, just to add another element, is that Clea's father loves the supernatural. He loves the supernatural, and he is obsessed with the elixir of life. Makes sense, right? Makes perfect sense. And so through this connection with the elixir of life, he went in search of it. And this is what brought him to South America, we learn. So anyways, put that all aside. I know, yeah. Clea decides to go on a photojournalism trip to Rio de Janeiro. Very handy that this happens. She decides that while she's there, she's going to look into her father's disappearance and see if she can figure out what happened. Well, surprise, surprise, when she's down there, oh my gosh, it's the person that she sees in her pictures. She runs into him. He immediately bolts. She chases him. Thus ensues a mad dash through the jungle till she eventually trips and he turns back to see if she's okay. So, anyways, through this whole story, we learn that Clea and this man have a connection that has lasted the centuries, that has been around for many, many years. And they are destined to have this meeting. They are destined to have this connection. And it takes them on this journey to find Clea's father. It takes them on a journey to find the elixir of life. It takes them to Japan. It takes them back to Connecticut. Anyways, okay. So that I think is the basis of the story. As you can tell, it goes in a few different directions. I was telling Fiona yesterday that one of my big I will stop reading this book if this happens, or I will almost stop reading this book if this happens, is when characters do things that are so far out of the character that has already been created for them, and it just makes no sense at all. Unless there's a specific reason that they are now doing something out of character. But I find in this book, Clea does that, and it drove me absolutely crazy, where she makes these choices that have no relation to the person that they've set her up to be. And yeah, so I found that really annoying. As you can tell, this was not my favorite book. It was not a terrible book, to be honest with you. Hilary Duff co-wrote it with an author, Elise Allen. So maybe she had a bit of guidance that could form it into a bit of a story. It just felt like there was too much going on, and it ended on a horrible cliffhanger that I will never find out what happens, because I don't think I'm planning on reading the next one. But I mean, it was the beginning was not bad. Clea was an okay character. I mean, you could feel sympathy and empathy for her because of her dad. You could kind of root for this relationship that had been budding between her and Ben, until this other person comes into it. Yeah, it wasn't a bad story. I just feel like it kind of 3/4 of the way through just took a turn in a very strange direction, and people started making choices that had no bearing on anything else. So I don't know if this is really a recommendation, but if you are looking for kind of like a dark romance that has a bit of magic to it, this might be the book for you. If you're wanting kind of that timeless love that lasts forever, and whether it should last forever or not, this might be the book for you. So yes, that is Elixir by Hilary Duff.
Thank you so much, Sadie. Yeah, I actually
cried.
didn't.
I cried. Right.
Was a very entertaining description. I didn't even know that Hilary Duff wrote a novel or 3. So there you go. All right.
Sorry, I just have a follow-up question. So in the pictures, when you say he's in the sky, like is he just like floating like a video game character that you've picked up and just kind of like legs akimbo?
I think so. So she's looking at like this scene of this old, maybe it was a cathedral, I think. And there was like these parts of the building that kind of go out that someone could potentially stand on, not safely, and they shouldn't. And he was described as being right next to that, not actually standing on the building, but in the sky right next to the building. Yeah.
She sees this, she's like, oh, better take a nap.
I mean, it takes her a while to decide that she's been up for like 36 hours. I think she just naturally falls asleep at that point with all of the lights and the Food Network on, because she is terrified. At the beginning, she is terrified, but she soon realizes that maybe she doesn't need to be terrified, or maybe
That
she
is
does,
love.
because she doesn't know anything about him.
But he's flying and stalking her, and apparently saw her when she was a baby, which is super gross.
Right? A little creepy. Yeah.
Twilight vibes?
I don't know.
Anyway, we're gonna pivot. So we are gonna go to our existential question. So we have all chosen books today that we probably know a fair amount about the author. So what I would like to know is what makes you pick up a debut novel when the author doesn't necessarily have literary cred. What will make you say, no, I'm gonna read this book. This is drawing me.
For me, most of the time is other people's literary creds, other people who say, hey, you should read this. And it's generally like other authors that, they blurb them. And I'm like, okay, well, if they are choosing these particular people to write about it, then they're probably, hopefully similar to those authors. And if those are the authors that I love, then that's usually how I, will at least pay more attention to them. Of course, also premise, would be another one. Or like if there's something, yes, but I would say generally it's because of the recommendations by other authors that seems like this would be something similar to their style. And if they like it and I like them, then yeah, this is likely a good match.
Yeah, it's always nice to have someone vouch for it. In my case, RM of BTS, if he vouches for it and it's a debut, I will absolutely pick it up. The other thing is like in the long-standing, continuous, unsolvable debate of plot versus character, I tend to fall pretty hard on the plot side of things. So regardless of whether the writer is established or whether this is their debut, if the plot intrigues me enough to pick it up, then that's usually enough. They don't necessarily have to have like the literary backing for them. Sorry, Virginia, I can see your face, but plot is important.
I have to say in this case, I do agree with that. I think that I will go strictly based on the plot and the description, and they don't need to be known to me as long as that is interesting enough for me and seems like something that I would like to read, then I will give it a try and I'll pick it up. I might not pick up their next one depending on the book, but I will kind of give it a try based on the plot.
Yeah, for me, I think premise and sort of recommendations by other authors are kind of equally important. If I'm seeing like good recommendations, if it's getting some good reviews, and then also the premise is intriguing to me, then that's something that will make me pick it up.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of force that. I feel like I've put put a lot of trust in the publishing industry now more than I used to, of like the blurb, but then the blurb with the cover, and like trusting that the vibe that they like carefully curate is giving the vibe that I want to read. But I also find if there is somebody who's written poetry collections and then like a short story collection, and then this is their debut novel, for me that's usually like a, oh, pick it up, because they're gonna be like, I don't know, they're just gonna write this like style of book that I really like.
It's because they've got chops, right? They can actually write. And I think like the topic that we've chosen is very interesting to kind of link with this question, Fiona, is that at the time that my particular book that I chose, is that there was a lot of like anger in the literary world that a lot of these celebrities were getting these novel deals, these huge book deals, because they have that name recognition, and making it more difficult for these debut authors to kind of get eyes on their books and get more publicity. And so yeah, that it's a really good question that you chose.
But I feel like there's also like the case of people who can write very good short stories and could probably write very good poetry, but cannot write a novel. I feel like there's separate skills that is needed to sustain a whole novel, and also separate skills to be able to like write a short story in a very few amount of pages and to like really hit the point. So I feel like there's two different skills, and I don't know if people can do both all the time.
Maybe that's a subject for another podcast of like read the poetry and then the novel. It is true. Like a novel is a
No,
marathon.
no.
Double the homework for the podcast. But yeah, like a novel is a marathon, right? And sometimes I would argue short story writers, if they're really good at that particular format, sometimes they just don't have the staying power. But poets, I don't know. I think they got it.
Yeah, because even if they like because I'm not a plot person, even if they can't do the whole arc, you're still enjoying the like micro parts of it. And for me, that's generally enough. But on that, let's go back to Kareen and hear about yes, your choice.
Yes, my controversial novel at the time it came out in some circles of very specific people. Yeah, so this was a real struggle. Like Fiona, I had initially misread the brief. So I don't actually have a novel. I have a collection of short stories, but it still counts. Last night in a panic, I tried to pick up a novel and I picked up the Steve Martin book that we have on Libby that started with the main character drugging a woman. And I was like, I think I'll stick with this. Because while it is, in Roxane Gay's words, aggressively bland, it is inoffensive. It is inoffensive. Um, yeah, so this book was a little bit controversial when it came out because it came at the same time as like a spate of these similar things of celebrities, usually white male, coming out with their novels to great fanfare, great acclaim, huge print runs, while a lot of, debut authors and established authors trying to get their name out there in, the métier that they work in were a little bit miffed. And it kind of boils down to, do you want your doctor to also fly airplanes? Like, maybe you focus on being really good at one thing and don't worry about trying to be good at everything. Like, if your doctor is a really good doctor, don't take a helicopter ride with them because they're probably not as good at the helicoptering as they are at the doctoring. And this, I would argue, is also the case for this collection by Thomas Jeffrey Hanks. Famous for his comedy and dramedy chops. He's an American cultural icon who has starred in, and I had to write these down, Big, League of Their Own, Splash, Forrest Gump, Saving Private Ryan, Catch Me If You Can, Apollo 13, Sleepless in Seattle, and others, just others. The man can't stop. He's also a distant cousin of Abraham Lincoln and Fred Rogers, because of course he is. He's the most American in some ways. And he also really loves typewriters. Everyone needs a hobby. And so he actually wrote these short stories on a vintage typewriter because, again, that's what he does. A few of them were published in the New Yorker magazine, and then eventually I think the editor was like, "Oh, Hanksy baby, like you've got some skills, you've got some chops. Why don't you make a book?" And of course, because he's Tom Hanks, everyone was like, "Yay!" And like, should they have? Should they have? So yeah, it's a collection of 17 short stories, some of them longer than others in the way that short stories are. They are, if I had to pull some adjectives out of the air, good-natured, about simple men, some simpler than others. You really understand that he really gets Forrest Gump as a character and is able to really dive into that psyche very easily. They're a little bit curmudgeonly. He really hates technology and just yearns for that newspaper print. The Guardian, in their review of it, called it fusty, which I could get behind. And I'm going to go with folksy. So this is going to be really hard to describe because you read them and then you ultimately forget them. So a couple of the stories center around the unnamed narrator who was a realtor, so and then sells his mom house and makes a lot of money and then decides to become a sloth until a manic pixie dream girl named Anna, his on and off girlfriend from high school, kind of gets him out of his rut and like, maybe we'll have adult relations and maybe not because I'm a wild spirit that cannot be tamed, but I'm going to force you to go jogging. One of their other friends, Steve Wong, who's really good at bowling, because of course there's bowling in this book. Of course there is. It's the most Americana. And M Dash, who also, okay, and here's where it gets a little weird. They work at Home Depot, but then they also built a rocket that went to the moon. It might be a metaphor, and it might not be. It might not. And, there are also stories about working in a newspaper and hating that people read the news on their phone. There's stories about how much one lady just really loves typewriters and how they're really great and we should bring them back. Um, I'm really like searching my mind right now because this is really hard to remember what they're about. Oh yeah, there's the one about the guy at a press junket who's so aggressively stupid that he doesn't realize what's going on. Um, yeah, and again, there are 17 of them. I remember distinctly about 4 of them. Um, is he a bad writer? No, he actually isn't, which is kind of like a pleasant discovery, is that he is competent. He's really competent at writing. I think it's just that it needs a little like pizzazz, needs a little showbiz sparkle, and his stories are just kind of folksy. So I'm actually going to again end with Roxane Gay's review, which I enjoyed quite a bit. Which again, these stories are aggressively bland. They aren't memorable. They are aggressively competent, but they aren't necessarily good, and they certainly aren't bad. They just are. Alas.
Thank you so much for that. I love that Roxane review, and it kind of makes me think of the flip side of famous people who write and think about people who write who become famous, or become sort of like influencers in a larger scale than just the internets. And Roxane Gay is like a personality that I love, that I know because of writing rather than the other way around. I think I prefer it that way. And I think Tom Hanks can probably handle the criticism, but that sounds like a total nightmare to me. Maybe something that would be like, a great present for a relative, and also sounds like spending a lot of time with a relative that you don't really want to be with. That is what that book sounds like to me. So we are going to go over to Virginia now, and I know Virginia has chosen a person who, to me, feels like the exception to the rule. So I am really hoping that Virginia is going to show us that, but no hard feelings if you hated it.
Well, I definitely cheated because I actually know this celebrity by his work as an author first, rather than his music. So I did read a new book for this episode, but probably took the easy way out. And I feel like it's the right choice given all my book friends' experience today so far. And so I've got Devil House by John Darnielle of the Mountain Goats. Now, I'm going to let my book friends tell you about him because I think at least 2 book friends here, maybe more, are fans, and they're much more qualified to tell you about his music. But I'll tell you about him as an author. This is his 3rd novel, and I read all of them. Universal Harvester was the first one that I read, and that remains my favorite. And then I went back to read his debut, The Wolf in the White Van, and now Devil House. Now, I'm going to probably say that Devil House is probably his most, I feel like, accessible work, maybe the least weird in some ways. I just love Universal Harvester so much. I was expecting a different kind of John Darnielle, but I think I got something a little bit different in this one. But I will also say that this is probably a more complex one in terms of the structure. But no matter which book you read, if it's by John Darnielle, he's going to make you feel this dread that is deep in your guts. And this one not just does a number to your guts, but also does a number to your mind as you try to like navigate this labyrinth that is the Devil House. So Devil House is the name of the latest book project of true crime writer Gage Chandler. He's relatively successful as a writer. You can actually buy one of his books at the airport bookstore. One of them has been made into a movie. And his agent decided and suggested to him that the Devil House would be a project for him. That should be his next book. Knowing that Gage likes to really get close to the source material and really immerse himself into the events, his agent thinks this is perfect because the house where the 2 murders happened is up for sale. It's in Milpitas, California. It's super cheap. he can just move there. So he wants Gage to buy the house, move to inn, and like you can't get any closer to the scene than that. And before it was a house, this was once a diner, and then it turned into a comic book store. And then the owner of the comic book store decides to turn it into a pornographic book and video store. And then it was abandoned, and that's when the murders happened. And now it's a house. And 2 people were murdered there with a giant sword. And it being the 80s, everyone believes that these 2 were sacrifices in a satanic ritual. Lots of people were interviewed, lots of people were questioned, but they never found a killer and no charges or arrests were ever made. And Gage realizes that this is exactly the type of case that he is particularly interested in. It's the type that everyone talks about afterwards. Everyone has these wild conjectures, and it really somehow get a hold of people's imaginations. And there's always like afterwards rumor flying about what really happened. And it's the type of story that turned into an urban legend or has the potential to turn into an urban legend. And that's the stories that Gage is particularly interested in. So Gage moves in and he starts ripping out all the floorboards and trying to tear open the wallpapers to try to find what's left of that place where the murders happened. So what will he discover? Now, first of all, Fiona talked about earlier about covers and putting trust in the publishing cover. If you look at this and you think it's a horror novel, let me tell you, this is not a horror novel at all, despite the title and also the cover and maybe also what you know kind of about John Darnielle's kind of writing. It is a story that really examines the true crime genre, the writing of it and the reading of it and the sort of a collective fascination and obsession with this genre and what it means to write a true crime story. What does it take? How can you tell such a story? How do you tell such a story? And looking at what you omit in that version of the story for the sake of storytelling, but also what you choose to emphasize, what you place value on. And in hindsight, what kind of thing that somebody might have done or may not have done, or what kind of like really boring object that suddenly takes on these really significant value once you look back. And what are the things that you gather to support your story, and what are the things that you discard in the process? And that may be something that you do with many, many types of writing, but what happened when your story is about someone who died, someone who has taken the life of someone else? What does that mean when you do that for the sake of storytelling? And of course, John Darnielle being John Darnielle is not just going to give everything away like in a straightforward manner. So we are going to examine this idea of a true crime story from many, many different angles. We got Gage Chandler, author, gathering the facts right now, writing this current story in Milpitas. We got the teens who lived in the town at the time of the murders, when we hear from them. And one of them has even worked at that store while the murder, while just before it got abandoned. We also get the story of Gage's previous book, The White Witch of Morros Bay, where we hear from the killer, the victims, and someone also related to the victim. And the story allegedly was of a high school teacher who has lured 2 of her students to her house and murder them because she's really a witch. And so what was that story about, and how does that contribute to Gage writing this current story? And then we also hear from someone who's unnamed, who's listening to Gage telling his story about writing this current book. And so, it's kind of hard. Like I listened to this on audio, which is narrated by John Darnielle, by the way. And I don't know if the book itself has maybe like a better way of delineating these different parts, but I can imagine this narrator structure will really frustrate some people, just because you never really quite know where you are, and who those people are. And sometimes I think that, if you really always need to know exactly what's what, then this might not be your type of book. But, as with all the John Darnielle book, you get a really, really good sense of place. Like he's really, really good at that. And I feel like when I first when I read it after I finished, I'm like, oh yeah, it's okay. Again, I was like it's all relative to what I compared to his previous book, but I think I like it more and more as I talk about it, because you're like peeling all these layers after layers, and you realize that like there's so much more to discover in his book. So I think if you have never read a John Darnielle book, I would probably suggest Devil House would be a good place to start. And if you have never listened to John Darnielle's music, well, let me turn it over to our resident experts on the Mountain Goats, and they can tell you more about him because I know we have some big fans here. Allison and Fiona?
I'm going to leave it to you, Allison, because I know you are a big enough fan that you are going to the Mountain Goats when they come in the fall.
Yes, I am a big fan of the Mountain Goats as musical artists. John Darnielle is the lead singer and was for a time the only member of the Mountain Goats, despite the plural name. They've been recording since, oh gosh, I believe the 90s. And they have an extensive, crazy amount of backlog to get through if you want to listen to their music. They are currently touring for their most recent album, which is Bleed Out, which is a sort of concept album based on the idea of action movies and like specifically like 60s to the 80s action movies that Darnielle was watching a lot of during quarantine. It's the music by the Mountain Goats is really interesting. It's sort of alternative rock, folky. One of the songs that they're most well known for is called No Children, and it is about a divorce or about a couple who are trying very hard not to divorce, but like the memorable lyric is I am drowning, there is no sign of land, you are coming down with me hand in unlovable hand, and I hope you die, I hope we both die. The music is emotional and weird but fantastic, and I'm really jealous that Virginia thought of John Darnielle as someone to read for this topic, because he's really he's got away with words, let's say that. And if you want, I highly recommend listening to the Mountain Goats. My favorite album of theirs is Transcendental Youth.
That's mine too. Thank you, Allison. Yes, I'm so glad that John Darnielle did not disappoint. You definitely won this episode, Virginia. All right. That brings it back to me for our final book. And my book is about Elsie. And Elsie is a dairy cow. She lives her life on a small farm in upstate New York, and most days are the same. She grazes in the field with her ride or die best friend Mallory, and they have sassy quips between each other, sort of akin to tween girls. Is kind of the vibe that Elsie gives off. She's sassy and sarcastic and deadpan, and very lovable. And she is just living her life as a cow. At the saddest things that's happened to her is the disappearance of her mom, but she knows that that is part of life and that happens to everyone. All the cows on the farm. The men are absent and the fathers are absent, and the mothers just disappear at a certain point, at which point you become a mother. And that is the life of a cow. Everything changes one day when Elsie finds out the reality of humans, which and cows and the relationship that they have. She stumbles upon the farmer's family watching a documentary about cattle and how they are killed and hung up and drained of blood and eaten. And she sees all of these images flash before her eyes, and she passes out because her whole world is turned upside down. At the same time, Mallory has made her way into the bullpen and has had her first love, and their lives just completely diverge. As Mallory enjoys the blissfulness of uh, looking forward to becoming a parent, and Elsie finally understands the reality of a cow's life. So after some time, Elsie wanders back to the television and learns that there is this place called India, where cows are revered. She gets it in her head that she is going to make her way to India and go and be a goddess there. This is a very short book. Sorry. And it kind of has especially because I listened to it as an audiobook, it sort of has this feeling of like a stand-up performance. The way like Elsie addresses the reader, she is always making quips about her editor, about how this and that they wanted them to keep it out, and all of these sort of like human references and puns, and it's quite amusing, but maybe not for 3 hours. That was sort of my response, is like, this is like the first hour I was loving it, and then after that it got crazy with this. She meets a Jewish pig, and there are a lot of jokes about being Jewish. I can only assume that the author is Jewish. And she also meets this turkey with a little too much bravado, who's quite obnoxious, and they all embark on this adventure together, and you have to really, really suspend disbelief. If you are okay with the idea that a turkey can fly a plane and a cow can give milk before having a baby, then if you can let those go, this is a delightful romp. My experience of the audiobook was also very interesting because it is narrated by the author. So this author is playing a sarcastic tween cow, and that author is also David Duchovny. So, like I said, the first hour of basically listening to David Duchovny put on the persona of this tween cow, and pretty much do a stand-up show in that persona, was very amusing, and I actually like enjoyed a lot about it. It's quite heavy-handed in terms of like the soapbox, and for me that is totally okay. I don't mind that, but I think that for others that would be like a big no-no. He talks a lot about there is some like negativity around technology, um and obviously and around like the way we treat animals, environmentalism, and he does throw down a lot of like stats. He makes it work in the character of Elsie. So overall it was an enjoyable read. I think I think this might have been David Duchovny's first novel. I'm not 100% sure, but it definitely had that feeling of like, okay, this works as like a short form, like for your first novel, but like you wouldn't be able to pull this stunt again. Like you're gonna have to get a little more writing chops just because of the constant addressing the audience and this whole shtick with the editor. But yeah, and I do, I would recommend it especially for teens. Like I know teens have all sorts of interests and they're all different in what they read, but it definitely had that feeling of like playing on, like Animal Farm and like these other personification of animals that might be like very tangential to them if they've recently read them, and then just constant quips. Everything was done for either for the humor or for the soapbox is sort of like how this unfolds. So I think it was like it had a lot of payoff in that, but was also accessible. So I can definitely see it as something that that some teens would really enjoy. And for a novelty, I think that anybody could enjoy it. He is an interesting person. I don't know a lot about him, but if you've watched The Chair, Sandra Oh's recent show, he plays he plays himself in it, but he's just like totally aloof and like brazen and ridiculous, and it kind of made me like almost like almost like Keanu Reeves in Always Be My Maybe, like just sort of gave like this sort of like, okay, like I like the sense of humor of this person, that they're able to laugh at themselves, and kind of drew me to him after really only knowing him as Mulder. So I think that David Duchovny definitely gets a pass for me. Sounds like Allison gave him like a soft pass as well. So maybe not John Darnielle, John Darnielle level, but I think it's worth picking up a David Duchovny book. Thank you all for taking part in that experiment. It was definitely interesting. Also reflecting that we had 4 authors and they were all white and 3 of them were men. So I think it does say something about what they think they're able to sell based on someone's name. Definitely very interesting. Maybe in the future we could do a memoirs and autobiographies of famous people. I don't know. Thank you all for going through this exercise. And thank you, listeners. We will see you next time on Keep It Fictional.